Our program committee and I are responsible for the selection of the programs this year, but our selection process is due largely to our membership and audiences who request topics for the presentation. Topics can relate to issues of national, statewide, or local concerns. Our programs are scheduled twice a month on the second and fourth Saturdays of the month at 3 p.m. in this room, and they are all open to the public. But before we begin, a brief announcement and a reminder. First, please feel free to help yourself to the snacks that are to your left. We have individually packaged chips, sweet snacks, water, sodas, beer, and wine. We also invite you to stay around after our program today to meet our guests at the tables at the back of the room. And our guest speaker will give you more information. Secondly, we want to remind you about our participation policy. After our presenter has concluded her presentation, we will have a question and answer period. We ask you that you keep your questions to the presenter limited to 1 minute and in the form of a question rather than just an opportunity to make a statement. Our presenter this afternoon is Ms. Allyson Ball, and she's a resident of Charlottesville, Virginia. But Allyson spends her winters here in Green Valley. Having studied the broader topic of U.S. immigration for 6 years, Allyson informs the general public about this important topic nationwide. So with that, I'm turning the program over to Allyson. Give her a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Kathy and George, and thank you to the Green Valley Democrats for having me speak. And of course, most importantly, thank you to everyone who's come to hear this topic. As it was mentioned, I have spent about 6 years here as a snowbird in Green Valley, but I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and during that time, I've been studying immigration to try to sort out what's been happening with immigration, what has happened in the past, and what might happen in the future. So I only have about 10 slides today, but what we're going to be talking about is the basics of U.S. immigration, and then what's happening at the border. And as you're well aware, there's been a trade-off over time, these last probably 40 to 50 years, with our U.S. immigration policy. The trade-off has always been, we will make changes to your immigration policy and laws if you are willing to increase the security at the border. And what we've seen over that time is a lot more money and people being put towards the border for border security, but no real significant changes related to the basics of our immigration laws. So we're just going to do a brief summary of what those laws are, and I'd like to spend a little time and explain where those laws have become outdated and where we find that they're somewhat problematic in the world that we live in today. It's not helpful for the rest of the world, and it's not helpful for what we'd like to do within our country. And then I'll turn to what's going on at the border today and some of the recent changes we've seen, and we'll see how that factors in. So here, as I said, is our overview. We'll start I have 3 slides talking about where we stand with legal immigration today. And then we'll spend more time and more slides on what's going on at the border and how this is affecting our policies with the asylum seekers. And then we'll open for comments and questions. So some of you heard me speak before, have seen this chart before. What this is it shows over time, and there's time along the bottom. Each one of these columns is 1 decade. So this is 1 decade's worth of time, starting here in the early 1800s and going all the way to 2029. And the most important things for you to see are, of course, this buildup in the 1800s of immigration. Each one of these is 1 decade, and you can see then At the end of the 1800s, we saw almost 8 million people coming in during that last decade. So there was a buildup here, and if you match the colors here with the colors on the map, you see most of these people were Europeans. But then in the second century here, the buildup also building up to a high. You'll notice if you match the colors that we're seeing more people from more diverse places. This is all a summary of legal immigration into the U.S. This is based on the laws that we have and what we allow for people to come into the country and become U.S. citizens over time. One of the important things to look at is at the end here that we see 10 million people came in this very last decade here on this chart. And that's important. That's about a million new citizens coming into the country every year. And that was a standard that was important because it helped us with our economy. It helped our economy to grow. So that's a number that we want to see going forward. Now, in 1965, Congress passed the law called the Immigration and Nationalities Act. We really haven't changed that law much since 1965, and it's become outdated. The basis of that law, it's about a 1,000-page law, is what are the various ways that people can come into our country. So on this page, we're going to just look at a collapsed version of what are the various ways that people can come to our country, get a visa, and become citizens. These are all pathways to citizen, examples of ways to come in. Most of our visas are related to family reunification. People bring their spouses, people bring their children, people eventually can move down the hierarchy of the visas, and they could bring their brothers and sisters. But that we have many, many visas that are outlined in this one law, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. We also allow for some professional and work visas. Not very many, 140,000 you can see there. We have a diversity lottery or a diversity visa, and that's also a very small number. Just 55,000 people come in every year, and they have a pathway to citizenship through that one set of visas. And then we have what we call humanitarian visas. There are several kinds listed here. There are others that we haven't listed here. But the first one we have is a special immigrant visa, which is only for Afghani and Iraqi citizens that have helped our armed forces or our government as we were in a conflict in their country. Now, we'd like to think that the Afghanis that we saw come into our country last year and the year before would come in through one of these visas, but we'll see in a minute why they weren't able to do that. The second is refugees. Now, a refugee is somebody who's been declared by the UN as being a refugee. They have been, and here's the definition down here. They've been persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. That's a very important definition because what you see is it's based on persecution. It's not based on poverty. It's not based on climate change. It's based on persecution. This is all based on World War II. It comes from the laws and the international treaties that were resulting from World War II and what was going on during that war. Now, all of these people on this page, except for this very last one, asylum seekers, all of these people are applying for visas from an overseas location. They're not here in the country. They go to the State Department or the embassy in their location where they're living, and they apply for the visas, which are then they are vetted as individuals. Their application is vetted and approved, and then they get a visa to come here to the States. Other than this very last group, the asylum seekers, all these people are applying and vetting from overseas. Now, this asylum seekers becomes very important when we start talking about the border. But it's just important to remember that an asylum seeker, like Martina Navratilova, who came here as a tennis player and decided to seek asylum, once she stood on our soil, she could ask for asylum. And that's what she did. Now, from Charlottesville, I've worked with other folks who are asylum seekers. And the case that I'm the closest to is a woman named Maria, who came from El Salvador with her son, who was about 8 years old at the time. And what she did was she went to the San Diego port of entry, and she presented herself there, and she said, I'm seeking asylum, I'm from El Salvador. And I guess she spent about 7 days in what they call the hielera, the ice box, in Border Patrol, waiting for the decision to be made. But once they decided, yes, she could stay in the United States as an asylum seeker, the next step would be for her to go to where her sister was living, which was Charlottesville, and that's where we met. But she had a sister who was there who could sponsor her and approve and say that she would pay for her financial well-being and take care of her education and take care of her health care while she waited for the hearing in the court. And the court, unfortunately, was very busy, and our courts have a big backlog, and so she was unable to get a court hearing until February of 2023. She came in about 2019, so there was a long wait for her. While she waited, her son got into the school, she got permission to work, she got a job, but as an asylum seeker, that was the process. So that's legally the process for her to enter the country, ask for asylum, and then wait for the court hearing for a final determination. Only the courts can decide, in the case of the asylum seekers, whether she can stay or not. Now, here's another important fact, because we're going to talk about asylum a little bit more when we talk about the border. But this is also very important. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but I'll read it. The U.S. takes asylum seekers from anywhere, meaning they can be anywhere in our country. They could fly in, and they could be at the airport, they could be at the port of entry, they could cross the border, and they could ask for asylum from that location. So we take asylum seekers from anywhere. We've agreed by law and by international treaty we will not put people in prison while they are seeking asylum. And we've also agreed by law, and we've also signed international treaties saying we will not turn people back into harm's way. So these are all the agreements we've made, and these are our laws. And you'll hear, as we talk more about asylum, that maybe some of these have been broken in the decisions that we've made of late. Let me just tell you just briefly where we've gone wrong here. The family visas, as I said, they have a cascading priority of who's going to be let into the country based on the family relationship. But there's also another prioritization that's based on, or a qualification, and that's so many people from each country. There's a 10,000 person limit for each country. So let's say here as an example, I'm from Iceland, and I'm a US citizen now, and I want my brother to come and live here. He could probably waltz right in. But if I were a Mexican and I wanted my brother to come here, he might have a 20-year wait to come in. And so when someone says, well, why don't these people just stand in line? They would have to have a brother or a relative already here, but they would also have to stand in line for quite a while, depending on the country. So one of the ways that the system is broken is this country of origin limitation in each of the categories of the visa. Remember, we're talking over 80 visa categories. This is chopped up into little pieces, and it's become outdated. On the professional work visa, you see, we don't have too many of those, and there's a provision in the law that says if you are a temporary worker, we'll see the temporary workers on the next page. If you're a temporary worker and you've had a 3-year visa, and then you've renewed a second time for 6 years, and you qualify, you can get in line for one of these visas. But again, guess what? We have country of origin silos for this as well. So who's backing up in this? We have 500,000 people from India waiting for these visas. So again, the needs of the country economically are not being met by the visa system that we have in our law. The only way to change this is Congress. So when we say we really need comprehensive immigration reform, this is what we're talking about right here. This and on the next page. But I think you have a sense of this. We'll come back to asylum seekers when we get to the border. Now, just like we looked at the pathways to citizenship in the law, that original law from 1965, we also know there are over 100 visa categories that are these temporary visitors. Some you'd be familiar with. Travel and business visas we issue, again, from overseas. People are not coming here and getting them here. They get them from overseas before they come. Same for student and exchange visas. We mentioned the temporary work visas. You're familiar with maybe the H-1Bs, who are the high-tech computer people, or maybe the medical people. Those are the people we worry about not being able to get in permanently because we need those workers in our economy. This is an agricultural worker, temporary. This is a specialty worker. Again, not too many of those are available. This is 180 plus special editions, and I just read that they did have, I think last year, 355,000 of these visas, but that's hardly enough for our workforce needs. It's more than we have had, but it's still not enough. So we've had to make adjustments. In 1990, we added something called the temporary protected status. And so far we have about 355. That number's just recently bumped up because we've added more countries to this. But these are people who have come here, and while they're visiting, there's been trouble at home. There might be a military coup, there might be an earthquake, it might be something a natural disaster. And so 16 different countries now have what's called temporary protected status. It's a group visa for a specific country of origin group. And in some cases, people have lived here almost as long as since 1990. So of course, what's happened in that time? They've been married, some of them had children who are born here, therefore they are American citizens. We just have to think about if we were to remove this protected status, what would happen to those families? You may be familiar with DACA, the deferred action, thank you, deferred action for childhood arrivals, those people who were brought here very young. And this was actually an executive order. This was not something that was passed in the Congress. It's a long story, but of course every move that's made that isn't made by the Congress is refuted in the courts, and there is a court case coming up whether the DACA can continue on. In the meantime, we have about 700,000 people plus their families hanging in the balance, wondering if they will eventually be forced to leave the country and go home to their country of origin. And humanitarian parole is an issue that we haven't heard much of lately, but we talked about the Afghanis on the original, on the page before. What we really would have liked is to give all these Afghanis who were leaving Afghanistan special immigrant visas. They could have a pathway to citizen if they did that. Well, guess what? The fact that they had to leave so quickly from Afghanistan meant that the visa was no longer an option for them to get. They were no longer in the country, and some of the documents that they needed were not available. Some of the proofs that they needed were not available. And so they were brought in under this other qualification, which is humanitarian parole. Now, the problem with that is, unlike the SIV, which is what they wanted, which was a pathway to citizenship, this is not. This is a 2-year, and then you're done visa. So what are we going to do with these people? And it turns out what we ended up doing was allowing the Afghanis to come up here and be one of the countries that they could apply once they were here for temporary protected status. So there's a lot of action going on with those Afghanis. It was a very messy deal, and it was very messy because, again, our laws were not flexible enough to handle the changes. We've also brought some Ukrainians in under, some of them under humanitarian parole, some of them under family visas, but we're working to try to get more and more people involved in this humanitarian parole. Again, something that's being criticized and will be probably fought in the courts in the coming up months. And then the last one here is that we've just added Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti. We'll talk more about that in a minute in this humanitarian parole as an option. But it hasn't been used much in the past, but it's being used quite a bit now. So again, this page is just people who are here temporarily, either through their original visas or through a special consideration of some sort. These are workarounds because our law is not able to handle what we need it to do. Again, this is part of the comprehensive immigration reform that we would want to see. Before we really get into what's going on at the border, I just wanted to give you a bit of a reminder about the border. And the first thing is our trade partners. Mexico's here in the middle, and you see Canada here on one side and China on the other. If you look at that blue bar, what you're seeing is we are taking an awful lot of imports from China, right? And you'll notice that the second highest from whom we import is Mexico, and the third is Canada. And on the flip side, we export the most to Canada, and so Mexico is our second trade partner on the export side, and China is our third. So this means Mexico is our second trade partner, both for exports and imports. So that's just an important thing to know, especially because we're so close to the border here. So let's look at what the traffic was in 2022. These are legal crossings at the border per day. And on the far right, you'll see all ports of entry. And on the Nogales corridor, it's just about 5 ports of entry here in our local area. We can see that every day, over 6,000 pedestrians cross through the Nogales ports of entry every day. And in fact, during COVID, there were people going back and forth as well. Not as many, but there's still. This 2022 brings us back up really to pre-COVID levels on this traffic. Over 9,000 vehicles cross the border every day. Rail containers. If you're here in Green Valley, you probably hear the trains going south. We think those are the empty ones going down, and of course, full ones are coming back. So these are loaded rail containers, 123 per day. And then trucks. We have an awful lot of vegetables coming up from Sonora, from Mexico. Something like 45% of all the U.S. vegetables in the winter are supplied by Mexico. And so about 1,000 trucks a day. This is a topic for a different presentation, but most of the fentanyl, most of the drug traffic goes through the ports of entry in the trucks or in the trains. But as I said, that's for another presentation. So let's back up. Migration trends worldwide are very high. We've never seen so many people who have moved from their countries and who we expect to continue to move from their countries for economic reasons, for conflict reasons, for political reasons, and now we're seeing more and more people moving because of climate change. That's just on the worldwide basis. Here at the US-Mexican border, since the mid-1900s, a lot has changed here. At first, we saw a lot of single Mexican men who were coming here for income. That was the main motivation for them to come here. But now we see Mexicans, Central Americans, and other countries of origin. We'll look at that more in a minute. Now we also see families are fleeing to escape repression and poverty, and they're coming from all over the world. You'll see in a minute. Now, what's happened recently? In March of 20, there was a new policy that was implemented by the CDC. This was the Center for Disease Control. This wasn't even something that the White House came up with, but during the Trump administration, the CDC put out an order that said no asylum requests would be taken at the ports of entry for anyone from any country. So remember, there's traffic going back and forth. There's pedestrians, there's trucks, there's trains, but we're going to make sure no asylum requests at the port of entry, and we're going to expel Mexicans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, and El Salvadorans. This is a new policy. We're not going to talk to them. We're not going to see why they're here. We're not going to ask them if they have an asylum case. We're not even going to listen. We're just going to expel them back across the border. And that's what happened. People were immediately expelled, not only close to the ports of entry, but, always at the ports of entry, but at all times of the night and day. In fact, it's still going on where we are expelling people at all times of the night or day. Now, there's a couple problems with this CDC order. We've broken some international laws, we've broken some international treaties, and we've broken some criminal laws with this. What are they? First of all, remember how I said we take asylum requests from anywhere? Well, we're not taking them. So we're breaking that law. We're not allowing people their legal right to seek asylum here when we impose this Title 42. Secondly, we will not return people back into harm. Now, if you're a Mexican and you're going back into Mexico and that's where you've been harmed, you don't want to go back. If you're from Honduras, you also don't want to go back to Mexico because you're a very vulnerable population. Anybody that's not in their home country that's on the move is very vulnerable. So again, we are turning people back into harm's way by adhering to this policy. And the third thing, which may be the most significant, and we'll see why on the next slide, border crossers are normally charged with a federal crime if they've crossed. And we were lifting that ability to charge that crime. So as a result, if you cross the border, there would be no consequence for you to cross the border, and you'd just be turned back, you'd be expelled. And so what happened was, and we'll see this in the statistics on the next page, more people decided to come so that they could try multiple times because they knew there was no consequence for crossing the border. So one of the unintended consequences of this Title 42, in my opinion, is that people crossed multiple times, and we actually incented people to come now rather than waiting. Let's take a look at the numbers. I think I'm stepping on this. This is an annual, so this is 2017, 2018, 19, 20, COVID hit here, and then 21, 22. This first batch are our four neighbors, the closest neighbors, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And you can see over time, it was a dip in 2022 because that's when COVID hit, but these are what are called Customs and Border Protection Encounters. So for this group of people, they're going to all be expelled, right? That's what that Title 42 said. We're going to rapidly expel anybody from these four countries back into Mexico, and you can see the numbers shot way up. Now, experts say that 30 to 40% of these numbers are repeats. People who've crossed the border once and who've been expelled and who decide, well, I'm going to go back again. In fact, we know that the cartels charge for repeat crossing like 3 times. So if you cross once and you get expelled, you can just find your coyote again, and whatever town they crossed you in, you just go back to that town and you cross over again with them when the time is right. So we know that the business of the coyotes picked up during this time because they knew there was no consequence for crossing, and so it was easy to cross multiple times. Now was the time. Now, the next 4 neighbors are in this middle section here, and that's Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. So what's happened to those people? First of all, notice the uptick of the volume of people crossing. Here we have about 600,000 people in 2020 from those 4 countries, whereas 4 years ago we didn't have them. So one of the things that's happened at our border is that the volume of people from these different countries is increasing. And in this case, we're rapidly expelling. So think about this from the perspective of Border Patrol. It's one thing to pick somebody up and expel them rapidly across the border, as they're doing here. But if you're taking these people in, now these people aren't being expelled. What's happening to these people is like what happened to Maria. They were brought into Customs and Border Protection. They had to be housed and fed for a number of days, and then they were passed along. They're going to get into the country, and they're going to be able to either be here on that humanitarian parole or asylum. But we're going to let them in. But in the meantime, Customs and Border Patrol needs to work with these people. They need to feed them and house them and have medical support. And remember, they're not just all Mexican men looking for jobs. These are families with young children, women, and just all ages coming in through this group. So if you were Customs and Border Protection, you'd be worried because you don't have space to house these people. You don't have personnel to handle these people. And this came up quite rapidly. These numbers came up quite rapidly. Same over here, right? In the same time frame, not just these 4, but other countries, people coming from China, people coming from India, we have people from Turkey. There's people from all over the world coming to cross at this border, and the numbers were up. Again, these people also handled by Border Patrol, brought into the Customs and Border Protection. We're not turning them back to Mexico. They're coming in through humanitarian parole or through the asylum process. And so my estimation is that we've just swamped this. We've swamped Customs and Border Protection, and we've decided, well, what are we going to do? So let's see what the government decided to do with this situation, with this huge volume of rapidly expelling folks, more than we've ever seen. Again, 30 to 40% repeats. And this huge uptick here and huge uptick over there, those green bars. Too much work and too much volume. Looks like the border's out of control. And remember, if the border looks like it's out of control and there's no border security, we're not going to have a good conversation about changing that comprehensive immigration reform that we want, because we've made this trade-off of until we get the border secure, we're not going to change the law. So what did Biden do? The first thing he did early this year was he added Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians to the group that was being rapidly expelled. He said, I'm going to make Title 42 apply to this group, and we're going to have them over here. We'll rapidly expel those people rather than processing them. So that was his first decision, to try to get some relief at the border. The U.S. got permission from Mexico to expel 30,000 of these people a month if they crossed illegally. And we have seen an initial surge of border crossers from these countries, but by and large, this policy has worked if you're looking for reducing the congestion at the border. We're starting to see that there's less congestion there at the border. Now, again, what they're doing is still illegal. We've expanded the illegal processing of people at the border, but there are less of them. From their home countries. Not at the border, but we're saying we'll take people coming in from Cuba and Nicaragua and Haiti as long as they apply from their home country. Unfortunately, they have to have a U.S. fiscal sponsor. Somebody like Maria had to say, well, I'll pay for them. I'll pay for their housing and their food and their education. Or they also have to have a passport and they have to have a flight into the U.S. And they have to avoid certain places. They put restrictions on this so that people wouldn't continue to come here. They also started an app. Now, this is also very controversial. They started an app to allow online processing of exceptions to Title 42. People are living in shelters, say in Nogales in Sonora. They've been living there, say, 6 months, 9 months, women with young children. And so they are being processed with the help of lawyers through the system. They're able to get in, even though Title 42 would normally apply to them, they are getting through. And also, they'll be using this app once Title 42 is lifted, which will hopefully be soon. Now, this app is very controversial. On the one hand, some people are getting through that might not have gotten through as early as we had hoped, so that's a positive. On the other hand, there are issues with an app, right? If I'm not literate, I can't use the app. If I don't speak Spanish or English, the two languages of the app, I have a problem. So it's got some pluses and some minuses, and there's a lot of issues with the quality, and also it's already known that there are people who are unscrupulous who are talking to folks about using the app when they shouldn't and trying to take advantage of the people who are looking for asylum. Increased use of expedited removal just means we're going to be more harsh than we have been in the past if people are crossing between the ports of entry. And this transit ban says that if you have not applied for asylum, let's say you're from Honduras, and you've gone from Honduras through Guatemala, through Mexico, and you're coming here to our border, and you're applying for asylum. If you haven't applied for asylum in Guatemala or Mexico, we won't take your application here. Now, this is an issue that has come up in the past. This was something that Donald Trump tried to implement, and I think it was heard in the courts. I don't know if they adjusted the suggestion or the changes for this version, but there will be a public comment period on this portion of it. But again, the Biden administration is trying to reduce the pressure at the border by stopping people before they come to the U.S., as well as at the U.S. They have different rules. So what are some of those other changes? Again, we are supplying finances, border support. The Border Patrol have been down to these Central American countries, again, to strengthen their borders, because the whole point of our goal now is to prevent people from getting here. We've expanded, through negotiations, options for migrants who want to seek refuge or to work in these other countries. So we're negotiating hard with other countries to provide other options for people to live and to work. The U.S. has decided to accept more refugees, meaning those people who've been declared refugees from their home country, vetted totally in their country before they come here. They've talked about fast-track asylum hearings, and they have started doing that in 5 courts. Remember, the courts are backed up. Remember, Maria had about a 5-year wait before she could get into the immigration court. There are a little over 2 million cases now in arrears in the immigration courts. 800,000 of those are these asylum cases. So one option is to try to speed up the hearings so that we can get more people through the system. People would criticize that as problematic, because we want to be sure that people have adequate legal representation. But the fast-track asylum hearings have been started, I think, in about 5 courts. I think the numbers are showing that the asylum success rate is much lower when you speed through the process. I mean, these asylum cases take years to put together. They are very thick documents. They take the testimony. This is not an easy proof. They take testimony from the people, from the families, from the neighbors. They are looking for medical reports, police reports, anything that would justify. This is not an easy proof. So to speed through the process maybe doesn't give people adequate legal representation. And as you maybe remember from earlier lectures, if you're in immigration courts, there's no requirement for you to have a lawyer. So you may be standing on your own and doing all this unless you can either find a pro bono lawyer or you can pay. CBP facilities are expanded to hold in-process families. We've seen this here in Tucson. And there's a proposal to have more asylum officers and judges right at the border. That has not gone through, but it's certainly been in discussion for quite a while. But again, the question here always is, are we providing, at the very bottom, are we providing adequate legal representation? And we can speed things up and we can be more efficient, but is it giving the asylum applicants the full legally required access to the process that we'd like to see them have? So this is my final slide, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Our basic immigration law is broken. We talked about that. We have country-specific limits on the family visas. We know for sure that the agricultural sector would like more temporary work visas. We know the high-tech sector wants more professional work visas. We know that many Americans want pathways to citizenship for some of these people like DACA and TPS. And we've seen several really positive bills go through the House. They just don't get through the Senate. So those bills that have gone through the House will have to go through the House again, but it's very unlikely they even maybe would be passed now. So we may be in a holding pattern for the next 2 years. But we did have some traction earlier. We talked about the new immigration, any new immigration law versus the border security. We really have been at a stalemate. As I said, we've poured more money into the border security, but we really haven't made positive changes in our laws. And it's hard to know how we measure border security. Is that not one person gets through? Does that mean, only 1,000 a year get through? How do we measure border security, and how do we know when we have it? We know we're spending billions of dollars on our security through the personnel and the technology, but how do we know when we have border security? And then, is the U.S. asylum law and the whole system that we have, is it adequate? How can we increase the capacity to accept more asylum seekers at the border? We definitely want a solution in the long run that allows people to come to our border and present themselves for asylum. So we need more people in those ports of entry who can process these people. Right now, we don't have the capacity to do that. How can we get more cases to be heard by judges more quickly, but we don't want to sacrifice the quality? Should we give all asylum seekers legal advice? Now, that's another issue. In fact, that's what the petition is in the back of the room, trying to get at least those asylum seekers and other families here in Pima County who are going to immigration courts to have legal representation, not to have to go by themselves and try to understand what the system is. Should asylum expand to include climate change? Remember, we have an outdated law that's based on problems that happened to people during World War II. And we're seeing different needs by the people who are moving based on income, poverty, and climate change. So there have been proposals put forward that asylum seekers should be allowed to come here because of effects of climate that they've seen. Again, this would all have to be, all these changes require the Congress. And then what could the U.S. do to improve root causes? Again, the topic for a whole other conversation. We are not controlling people coming to us. It's very difficult to control those people who are coming to us unless we change what's going on in their countries of origin. It's very difficult, I think, for Americans to imagine what it's like to live in a country where not only are you poor, but you're oppressed. There's no recourse if something goes wrong. So that's just a whole nother topic for another day. But why don't I stop here and see if there are any comments or questions based on all this material.
A land border versus those that have neglected to leave when on a tourist visa.
Thank you for that question, yes. Of all the people who are here without the proper papers, we could call them unauthorized or undocumented, but I like the term unauthorized. There are about 11 million people in this country. More than 50% have overstayed their visas. Less than 50% are here because they've crossed the border. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
How many are Canadians?
How many are Canadians? I don't know the exact number, but there are 11 Canadians. There are 11 Canadians. I don't think any in this room. But
What are the grounds for asylum? You talked about the grounds for refugee status, but what are the grounds for
the
asylum?
grounds for asylum are pretty much the same. It's that same proof. It's persecution. It's the exact same proof. It's just they're standing in a different place. A refugee has to be outside of their country of origin. So a Syrian has to be in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey. They cannot just move within Syria to be an official refugee, but they must have proof of persecution for those proofs that I listed at the bottom there. And the refugee is the same. It's just they are physically here in the country. Yes.
I know of someone who's here on an expired work visa, and he's from Ireland. So he won't go back.
That's not I.
His brother. No, he says he can't go back because he'd never be able to come here again.
Well,
And
that's
if
right.
the problem is that bad in Ireland.
Right. So the work, yeah, somebody's here on an expired work visa from Ireland. You can't go home because you'll never get back here.
Right, so that supports what you're saying.
This is
If
part,
it's bad
right.
in Ireland.
Right. This is part of the problem, right? You've got these countries of origin who are defining how many people per year we can take for each of these visas in all these categories, and some are more popular than others, and that's caused. And so we haven't kept pace with the world or our needs. This is my main message. We've not kept the law current, and we've not put the money where we need to accommodate the changes we've seen in the world and for our own needs. Yes.
What is the current legal status of Title 42, which my understanding, it was in front of the Supreme Court, but it's on hold because of arguments from Republican governors?
Yes. I think the Supreme Court looked at Title 42. They were not examining it for the merits of whether they should keep Title 42. They were examining it for the merits of whether the states had the right to argue in front of the Supreme Court or not. Hopefully they won't get involved in this kind of discussion. Originally, Biden wanted to remove Title 42. Now he's expanding it, so it may be here to stay longer than we would like.
Yes, could you give me a status update on the special, I'll say, category that Cubans have enjoyed to some degree since the 60s?
What's the status of the special status for Cubans? You probably all know that used to be if Cubans just stood on our soil, they immediately got asylum. They were able to stay here, and they're not able to do that. I'm not the best person to ask. My understanding is that they must be here for a year, and then they will be given permission to stay of some form. And I don't know what the visas look like, but it's not immediate as it used to be, but it's still better than most. And this new law is going to change everything because it's imposing more restrictions on their ability to come here. Yeah, thanks.
Wouldn't it help to solve the problem of the delay in asylum hearings to simply appoint more judges?
Wouldn't it help if we just appointed more judges? Yes. In fact, Trump did appoint a lot more judges. The trouble with his judges, they're very conservative, so the denial rates have gone way up. But yes, to right now, I think there are something like 64 immigrant courts in the country, and something like, and I don't remember the exact number, 560 judges. There are quite a few judges. It's just not enough. The backlog is huge. And when I started doing these presentations about 4 years ago, the backlog was 800,000. We were just aghast, 800,000. It's now 2 million.
How many cases a year does an average judge hear?
I don't know how many cases a judge hears every year. Again, you think, well, these can't take that long, but they do. These are people's lives, and these judges, they have to prove different proofs. I mean, you should hear the lawyers talk about, I have to prove 5 different things in my case, and it all has to come in the paperwork, and they read it. It's not quick. These are not quick proofs. Yes.
I'm going to ask you to put a crown on your head again.
Oh, good.
This time
I'm getting the crown again.
Queen of the world.
Okay, Queen of the world.
And would you, how would you handle root causes?
Root causes. Well, this is my latest favorite topic, because what I'm trying to understand is what's gone wrong. And originally in this presentation, I had 2 pages about this topic, but we cut it for time. And what I've learned recently is that I'm most familiar with Guatemala, that we have a lot of corruption in Guatemala. So the courts are corrupt, the police are corrupt, the federal military is corrupt. We have a lot of remittances going back to Guatemala from people who live here. They send their money back, and all that does is it says to the government, you don't need to bother collecting tax money and working on education, because there's all this money coming back, and the local communities can put their money in. So we have that problem. So there's a lot of repression in these countries, and so it's one thing to say, well, we'll send money for development. And that sounds good as long as it gets into the right hands and it doesn't get scooped off by them. So there's a lot of political things, and you think, well, if you were Biden, what would you do? And I know Kamala Harris has been down working on these issues, but the work that she's doing really is promoting business, which allegedly creates jobs, but I'm afraid it might create jobs for not everybody, just certain people that are already rich. So we're going to make the rich richer, and so I think this is a very important conversation to have, because I don't think it's just Central America where these problems exist, all over the world. So thanks for
Number
that.
one is immigration issues are nothing new. My grandmother left 15 years old in World War I on the Italian-Croatian border there, and was turned away from the U.S. and wound up in Cuba, and came through one of your visas that you talk about, allowing Cubans to come in because she became a Cuban citizen. That's number one. So we have always had
We've always had problems with our immigration, right?
Number two is Title 40. When you talk about Title 42 and the illegality of it, one has to remember that we are living a public health emergency in this country, which Biden, reinstated several times throughout his presidency. And when you're in a public health emergency, you can bypass laws. It is legal to bypass laws.
Yeah. So that's a good point. That when we're in a medical emergency, we should be able to bypass our laws. I would agree with that. I'm not sure we are still in a medical emergency, and I'm not sure we should still be able to bypass that law.
I'm not saying it's right.
Sorry.
This is our last question down.
Last question.
The transit ban, is that legal?
The transit ban. It remains to be seen. I think we saw something like this proposed by Trump, or tried to be enacted by Trump, which I understood went to the courts, and it was shot down as not being valid. And so we have yet to see whether this will hold here in the Biden administration or not. It's hard to know. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Allyson. I want to thank you for your patience on the mic system. If you are an expert at mics, I would like to purchase a new system, so come and see me. And then I would like to turn it over for a last announcement from Catherine.
Yeah. Yes, before you go, please visit the booths here. One has some lovely pieces that were created by a lot of these people at the border, and the profits of that go to help support them there. But I just wanted to give you a quick note. In 2 weeks, our next presenter is going to be Dr. Cherie Meeks, who is president of the NCAA Tucson, and Miss Sandy Davenport, a retired master's level social worker. And they will be presenting their program entitled Proposed Legislative Reform of the Cash Bail Bill in Arizona. So please join us in 2 weeks, and we'd love to see you again. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me here today, but my hope would be that folks like the Green Valley Dems and others get more knowledgeable about our immigration so that they can understand what they want to support and what changes they think should be made so that we can make the changes to improve what we... If we could wave a magic wand, I would get the folks in Congress to come together to pass the legislation that would be necessary to make the changes that we talked about today.
More judges.
More